The scorching desert sun hung like molten brass over Durango as Sheriff Luke Carter wiped sweat from his weathered brow. The year was 1875, and the once quiet frontier town was transforming into a bustling hub of activity, thanks to the ever-expanding Southwestern Railroad Company. Luke watched from his office porch as teams of workers laid track beneath the merciless afternoon heat, their rhythmic hammering echoing through the dusty streets. The railroad's arrival had brought more than just steel and steam to Durango. It had drawn an unusual mix of people, including Joshua Lopez, an Apache scout who'd taken up residence in the old trading post at the edge of town. Unlike most natives who kept their distance from white settlements, Joshua had integrated himself into the community, serving as an intermediary between the railroad surveyors and local tribes whose ancestral lands lay in the Iron Horse's path. Caroline Hall, the owner of Durango's only hotel, stepped out onto her establishment's wraparound porch, her dark hair neatly pinned despite the oppressive heat. She caught Luke's eye and offered a knowing smile. They'd grown up together in this harsh land, watching it change from a wild frontier to something attempting civilization. The railroad was just the latest harbinger of that transformation, though not everyone welcomed its promise of progress. Nathan Allen, the railroad's chief engineer, had become a frequent visitor to Luke's office, bringing reports of sabotaged equipment and mysterious accidents along the construction route. The incidents weren't serious enough to halt progress entirely, but they created an undercurrent of tension that Luke could feel building like a thunderhead over the desert plains. Someone wanted to slow the railroad's advance, but their methods showed an intimate knowledge of both the land and modern machinery. The situation grew more complex with the arrival of Eleanor Nelson, a photographer commissioned by the railroad company to document their grand expansion. Her presence drew suspicious glances from both the workers and the townspeople, as she spent hours capturing images of not just the construction, but the surrounding landscape and its inhabitants. Luke noticed how she paid particular attention to Joshua Lopez, though whether from professional interest or personal curiosity he couldn't tell. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of flame, Luke made his usual rounds through town. The air was thick with more than just heat. Whispered conversations died as he passed, and he caught fragments of worried discussions about land rights, water access, and the changing times. The railroad wasn't just laying track, it was cutting through the heart of long-established ways of life. Joshua Lopez's trading post cast long shadows in the dying light, and Luke paused as he noticed unusual movement inside. The scout had been organizing a meeting between railroad officials and tribal leaders, scheduled for the following week. Through the window, Luke could see Joshua bent over maps spread across a rough wooden table, his fingers tracing lines that seemed to follow neither the proposed railroad route nor any trail Luke knew. The crack of gunfire shattered the evening's quiet. Luke's hand instinctively moved to his revolver as he spun toward the sound, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Flames were already licking up the side of the trading post, spreading with unnatural speed. Through the smoke-hazed windows, he could see Joshua Lopez struggling against two shadowy figures, their faces hidden behind bandanas. Without hesitation, Luke kicked in the door, his gun drawn. The heat hit him like a physical blow, and smoke immediately burned his eyes and throat. He could hear Joshua fighting somewhere in the chaos, but the flames were spreading too quickly, consuming the dry wood of the old building with terrifying hunger. The attackers had already fled through a back exit, leaving their victim trapped in the inferno. Following the sounds of struggle and coughing, Luke found Joshua pinned beneath a fallen beam, surrounded by burning maps and papers. The scout's eyes were wide with both fear and determination as Luke approached. Together, they managed to lift the beam enough for Joshua to slip free, but by then, the flames had nearly blocked their escape route. Luke half-carried, half-dragged the injured man through the fire, their clothes smoking and their lungs screaming for clean air. They burst out of the burning building just as the roof began to collapse, falling to their knees in the relative cool of the evening air. A crowd had gathered, including Caroline Hall and Eleanor Nelson, who rushed forward with blankets and water. As Luke helped Joshua to his feet, the scout grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You must come with me," he rasped, his voice rough from smoke. "There are things you need to know. Things about the railroad, about the land, about why they tried to silence me tonight." Luke's mind raced with questions, but before he could voice any of them, Joshua reached behind a barrel near the building's entrance, somehow untouched by the flames, and withdrew a bow unlike any Luke had ever seen. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift in the firelight, and the string hummed with an energy he could feel even from a distance. "This belongs to you now," Joshua said, pressing the weapon into Luke's hands. "It never misses its mark, but choose your targets wisely, Sheriff. The truth is not always what it seems." Luke stared at the bow in his hands, its weight somehow both substantial and ethereal at once. The carved symbols caught the dying firelight, dancing like living things across the polished surface. Around them, the townspeople were already beginning to disperse, their excitement fading with the flames, but Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous had just been set in motion. "We need to get you to Doc Isaac's," Luke said to Joshua, but the Apache scout shook his head firmly, his dark eyes intense despite his obvious exhaustion. "There's no time," Joshua insisted, pulling himself straighter despite his injuries. "The men who set this fire, they'll be watching the doctor's office. We must reach my camp outside Pueblo before sunrise." Caroline Hall stepped forward, her normally pristine dress smudged with ash. "At least let me tend to those burns first," she offered, but Joshua remained adamant. Luke recognized the urgency in the man's bearing. It was the same tension he'd seen in cornered men who knew they were being hunted. The moon had risen over the desert, casting long shadows across the empty street as Luke helped Joshua to the livery stable. The night air was cooling rapidly, a bitter wind whistling through the gaps in the weathered boards. Inside, Luke's stallion nickered softly in recognition while Joshua's pinto pawed restlessly at the straw. "The railroad men," Joshua said as Luke helped him mount. "They found something in the hills north of Durango. Something they want buried along with the ancient ones who kept it secret." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried in weight that made Luke's spine tingle. "The bow you hold, it's more than just a weapon. It's a key." As they rode out of town, Luke couldn't help glancing back at the smoldering ruins of the trading post. The bow was secured across his back, and he could feel it thrumming like a living thing, resonating with each hoofbeat. The desert stretched before them, a silver-painted landscape of shadow and starlight. They rode hard through the night, following game trails and dry arroyos that Joshua seemed to know by heart. The scout's breathing was labored, but he never faltered, leading them deeper into territory that few white men had ever seen. Around them, the desert was alive with night sounds, the cry of hunting owls, the rustle of wind through sage, the distant howl of coyotes. Near dawn, they crested a ridge overlooking a hidden valley. Below, nestled against red stone cliffs, Luke could make out the shapes of several wickiups, thin streams of cookfire smoke rising into the pearl-gray sky. Joshua relaxed slightly at the sight, though his face remained drawn with pain and worry. "The men who tried to kill me," Joshua said as they picked their way down the slope, "they work for Nathan Cross. He's more than just the railroad's agent. He's a collector of power, of secrets. He knows what lies buried in those hills, and he'll stop at nothing to claim it." Luke absorbed this information silently, thinking of Nathan Cross, the impeccably dressed man who'd arrived from Wichita 2 months ago, all smooth words and generous offers for land. There had been something in his eyes that Luke hadn't trusted, a hunger that went beyond mere business ambition. As they approached the camp, several figures emerged from the wickiups. Among them was an elderly woman whose bearing commanded immediate respect. Joshua addressed her in Apache, his words too quick for Luke to follow, but her sharp gaze fixed on the bow across Luke's shoulders, and her expression grew grave. "That is Rose," Joshua said quietly. "She is our medicine woman, and one of the few left who knows the true story of what sleeps in the Durango hills. What Nathan Cross and his men are willing to kill for." He swayed slightly in his saddle, the night's exertion finally taking its toll. "Sheriff, you're about to learn why some secrets are better left buried in the desert sand." The sun was rising now, painting the cliffs in shades of fire and blood. Luke helped Joshua dismount, watching as Rose hurried forward to tend to his injuries. The bow on his back seemed to grow warmer, as if responding to some unseen presence. Whatever truth lay hidden in those hills, Luke had a feeling it would change everything he thought he knew about this harsh and beautiful land. Sheriff Luke Carter wiped the sweat from his brow as he studied the strange bow in his hands, its weathered wood adorned with intricate Apache symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. 3 weeks had passed since he'd pulled the aging scout Joshua Lopez from the flames of Tucson's general store, and the mysterious weapon gifted to him in gratitude had already proven itself unnaturally accurate. Every arrow he'd loosed had found its mark with impossible precision, whether targeting practice dummies or hunting game in the harsh desert beyond the town's borders. The railroad surveyors were due to arrive any day now, their plans to cut through sacred Apache burial grounds weighing heavily on Luke's conscience. Joshua had warned him that the bow's power came with responsibility. It would guide true only for those who fought for justice. As Luke holstered the weapon across his back, his deputy Nathan Hall burst through the office door, face flushed with urgency. "Railroad men are here early, Sheriff, and they've brought hired guns." The scene at the newly constructed station platform made Luke's blood run cold. Isaac Nelson, the railroad's chief engineer, stood flanked by a dozen armed men as he addressed the gathered townspeople. His promises of prosperity and progress barely masked the underlying threats. Anyone opposing the planned route would face severe consequences. In the crowd, Luke spotted Joshua Lopez standing silently, his dark eyes fixed on the bow visible over the sheriff's shoulder. Eleanor Allen, the town's schoolteacher, grabbed Luke's arm as he passed through the crowd. "They're going to destroy everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not just the Apache graves. They want to demolish half the town to make room for their rail yard." Luke had always admired Eleanor's fierce devotion to preserving both the town's history and its future through her teachings. Now, seeing the fear in her eyes, he felt the bow grow warm against his back. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next few days. Isaac Nelson's crew began marking buildings for demolition, including Eleanor's schoolhouse and the shop where Caroline Carter, Luke's sister, sold her healing remedies to both settlers and Apache alike. The hired guns patrolled the streets, intimidating anyone who dared protest. Joshua Lopez disappeared into the desert, but not before warning Luke that ancient forces were stirring, awakened by the railroad's desecration. Late one night, Luke discovered Charlotte Hall, Nathan's wife, secretly meeting with Isaac Nelson behind the saloon. Instead of the confrontation he expected, he overheard them plotting to protect the town. Charlotte had discovered documents proving the railroad's selected route was structurally unsound, built on unstable ground that would eventually collapse. Nelson was willing to consider an alternate path, but his superiors were pressuring him to stay on schedule. The bow's energy seemed to intensify as Luke pieced together a plan. Working with Eleanor, he began documenting the geological instabilities Charlotte had uncovered. Meanwhile, Caroline and Rose Nelson, Isaac's estranged daughter who had sided with the townspeople, gathered evidence of Apache artifacts along the proposed route. The bow guided Luke to additional sacred sites, each arrow he fired revealing another crucial location that would require the railroad's protection or avoidance. But Caleb Hall, Nathan's brother and one of Nelson's hired guns, discovered their investigation. During a confrontation in the desert, he attempted to destroy their evidence and steal the bow, recognizing its power. The ensuing chase led them through a maze of sun-baked canyons, where Luke witnessed firsthand the bow's true nature. Every arrow he fired seemed to bend around impossible corners, herding Caleb away from sacred ground and eventually trapping him in an ancient ceremonial cave. The bow's magic had a price, however. Each time Luke used it, he experienced vivid visions of the land's history, centuries of Apache ceremonies, battles, births, and deaths. He began to understand that the weapon wasn't just supernaturally accurate. It was a conduit for the very spirit of the territory they were fighting to protect. Joshua Lopez returned from the desert with a small group of Apache elders, who revealed that Luke had been chosen as a guardian, a bridge between their world and the unstoppable march of progress. As tensions in Tucson reached their breaking point, Luke realized the bow's true purpose wasn't to fight the railroad, but to guide it. Working with Eleanor, Charlotte, and the Apache elders, he developed an alternative route that would preserve both the sacred sites and the town's future. Isaac Nelson, shaken by his daughter Rose's impassioned plea and the undeniable power of the bow, agreed to present their proposal to the railroad board. The hired guns, witnessing the bow's abilities, chose to stand down rather than challenge what they now recognized as something beyond their understanding. The desert wind carried whispers of change as Luke and Eleanor rode alongside the proposed alternate railway route, marking the delicate balance between progress and preservation. The bow, strapped securely to Luke's back, seemed to hum with anticipation as they crossed the sun-baked terrain. Eleanor's expertise in land surveying proved invaluable as they documented each sacred site and natural formation that their new path would protect. her quick hands sketching detailed maps while Luke kept watch for any lingering opposition. In Tucson, Joshua Lopez worked tirelessly with the Apache elders to document their oral histories, creating a compelling case for the cultural significance of the lands they sought to protect. The town's dynamics had shifted dramatically since Luke's intervention with the bow, with former adversaries now gathering regularly at Caroline's boarding house to discuss the future of their shared home. Even the most hardened skeptics couldn't deny the change in the air when Luke demonstrated the bow's impossible accuracy, splitting arrows at distances that defied natural law. Rose Nelson, inspired by the unity she witnessed, began organizing meetings between the railroad workers and local Apache families, fostering understanding through shared meals and stories. Her father, Isaac, though still wrestling with his role in the previous conflict, found himself increasingly drawn to these gatherings, particularly when Charlotte shared her knowledge of traditional medicine with the railroad's overworked medical staff. The turning point came when a group of investors from Durango arrived to assess the situation. Luke stood before them, bow in hand, and spoke not just of profits and progress, but of legacy. He described a future where the railroad would be remembered not for what it destroyed, but for what it helped preserve. The bow seemed to glow in the afternoon light, its presence a testament to the power of choosing wisdom over force. Caleb, one of the former hired guns who had witnessed the bow's power firsthand, became an unexpected ally. His knowledge of security helped identify vulnerable points along the proposed route where additional protection would be needed. Working alongside Nathan, who had extensive experience with railroad construction, they developed innovative solutions to protect both the tracks and the sacred lands they would pass through. As word spread of Tucson's unique approach to the railroad expansion, representatives from Pueblo and Wichita began arriving to observe their methods. Josephine, whose small newspaper had once criticized the entire project, now found herself documenting a story of transformation that readers across the territory eagerly followed. Her detailed accounts of the bow's demonstrations and the growing cooperation between all parties brought national attention to their efforts. The Apache elders, led by Joshua, began incorporating traditional ceremonies into the construction process itself. Each major phase was blessed, each bridge and tunnel acknowledged as a meeting point between two worlds. Luke found himself serving as more than just a sheriff. He became a symbol of the possibility of genuine cooperation between different ways of life. The bow's power seemed to grow stronger with each successful negotiation, each peaceful resolution. Eleanor's technical expertise proved crucial as they refined the alternate route. Her calculations showed that, contrary to initial fears, the new path would actually reduce long-term maintenance costs by avoiding areas prone to flash floods and sandstorms. The natural features that the Apache had long considered sacred turned out to be practical markers for the safest and most sustainable path through the territory. As construction began on the first section of the new route, Luke noticed something remarkable. The bow's accuracy seemed to extend beyond mere marksmanship. It guided them to water sources, warned of approaching storms, and even helped identify stable ground for laying tracks. The Apache elders explained that this was the true purpose of the weapon, not to defeat enemies but to protect and guide those who sought to live in harmony with the land. The transformation of Tucson continued as the project progressed. What had once been a town divided by fear and suspicion became a model of cooperation. Caroline's boarding house expanded to accommodate the steady stream of visitors who came to learn from their example. The bow, once a symbol of conflict, now represented the possibility of finding a better way forward, one that honored both the past and the future of the American West. The scorching afternoon sun cast long shadows across Durango's main street as Sheriff Luke Carter readied his horse, the mystical Apache bow slung across his back, seeming to hum with an otherworldly energy. His deputy, Nathan Hall, had just brought word that the railroad crew was under attack at Eagle Pass, some 15 miles north of town. But this was no ordinary raid. The attackers were using tactics Luke had never seen before, striking with impossible precision from extreme distances. Caroline Lopez stood on her father's porch, watching the sheriff prepare to ride out. As the town's schoolteacher and daughter of the railroad's lead engineer, she knew better than most what was at stake. The bow's leather wrapping caught the sunlight, reminding her of that fateful night 6 months ago when Luke had earned the weapon's loyalty by saving its previous owner from certain death. The situation at Eagle Pass had been deteriorating for weeks. Isaac Nelson, the railroad's ambitious young surveyor, had ignored local warnings about disturbing ancient burial grounds along the proposed route. Now workers were vanishing without a trace, their bodies found days later with single arrows through their hearts. Arrows that seemed to materialize from nowhere, defying the laws of physics and marksmanship. Luke's fingers traced the bow's intricate markings as he considered his options. The Apache scout, Joshua, had warned him that the weapon's power came with a price. Each perfectly placed shot drew not just on skill, but on the shooter's own life force. Use it too much, and it would consume you entirely. But with innocent lives at stake and the railroad's future hanging in the balance, what choice did he have? The desert wind carried whispers of an old prophecy, one that Eleanor Carter, Luke's grandmother, had learned from her Apache neighbors decades ago. It spoke of a time when the Iron Horse would awaken ancient spirits, and only one who could bridge two worlds would restore the balance. Luke had always dismissed such tales as superstition, but now he wasn't so sure. As Luke rode north, the landscape changed subtly. The usual desert scrub gave way to twisted formations of red rock, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The air grew thick with an electric tension that made his horse nervous, and even the ever-reliable Nathan kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting phantom arrows to materialize at any moment. At Eagle Pass, they found the railroad camp in chaos. Caleb Allen, the crew foreman, was trying to maintain order as workers abandoned their posts. Strange lights danced along the newly laid tracks, and the ground itself seemed to pulse with an angry heartbeat. But most disturbing were the arrows, dozens of them, each embedded exactly 3 inches deep in the wooden railroad ties, forming a pattern that Luke recognized from the markings on his bow. Rose Nelson, Isaac's sister and the camp's doctor, pulled Luke aside with trembling hands. She'd been treating workers who claimed they were being hunted by shadows that moved against the wind, guided by arrows that could turn corners and pass through solid objects. The injuries were unlike anything she'd seen. Not just physical wounds, but something deeper, as if the victims' very souls had been grazed. The confrontation, when it came, defied everything Luke thought he knew about combat. The attackers were neither flesh nor spirit, but something in between, their forms flickering like heat mirages. Only Luke's enchanted bow seemed capable of affecting them, each shot requiring more of his strength until he could barely stand. Nathan watched in horror as his friend's hair began to turn white with each release of the bowstring. Josephine Hall, Nathan's wife and the town's most gifted herbalist, had followed them to the camp. She recognized the signs from her own studies of native medicine. The bow wasn't just a weapon, it was a key. And Luke was unknowingly unlocking something that had been sealed away for centuries. The railroad wasn't just disturbing graves, it was breaking an ancient barrier between worlds. Charlotte Allen, Caleb's daughter, and an amateur archaeologist made the crucial connection. The bow's markings matched petroglyphs she'd documented throughout the region. They weren't just decorative, but formed a complex map of ley lines, power points that the railroad's route was inadvertently connecting. Each arrow Luke fired was completing this circuit, but to what end? The final battle tested not just Luke's skill, but his understanding of justice itself. The bow's true purpose revealed itself not as a weapon, but as a tool of restoration. Each perfectly placed shot didn't destroy the Shadow Warriors, but rather anchored them back to their proper realm. Luke had to trust in something beyond his training, letting the bow guide his hands as he worked to heal a wound in the world itself. When the dust settled, the railroad camp was quiet but transformed. The tracks now followed a slightly different route, one that honored the ancient pathways while still serving progress. Luke's hair remained streaked with white, a permanent reminder of the power he'd channeled. The bow's weight on his back felt different now. Not a burden of responsibility, but a bridge between worlds that would need constant maintenance. As the transformed railroad tracks gleamed in the setting sun, Luke knew his work wasn't finished. The Shadow Warriors had been anchored, but the bow thrummed with an urgent energy he'd never felt before. Through his connection with the ancient weapon, he sensed more disturbances along the line between Durango and Pueblo, where the railroad crews were still pushing forward, unknowingly disturbing more sacred sites. Eleanor, the station master's daughter who'd been documenting the strange occurrences, approached Luke with a leather-bound journal filled with carefully mapped ley lines. Her fingers traced the intricate patterns that now made perfect sense. The railroad's path had been inadvertently creating a massive circuit of power, one that could either heal or tear apart the delicate balance between worlds. In the distance, storm clouds gathered unnaturally fast over the desert landscape. Their purple-black masses shot through with veins of lightning that seemed to connect earth and sky. The workers, led by Nathan, had halted construction as the air grew thick with static electricity. Luke could feel the bow responding to each lightning strike, its wood warming against his back as if awakening to some ancient call. Caroline, the local schoolteacher who'd been translating old Apache texts, rushed forward with a weathered piece of parchment. The symbols matched the patterns Eleanor had mapped, revealing that the railroad's iron rails were acting as conductors for forces far older than any of them had imagined. The final section of track would either complete a healing circle or tear open a rift that could never be closed. Luke found himself caught between two worlds: the practical needs of progress represented by the railroad and the spiritual legacy he'd sworn to protect when he accepted the bow. The white streaks in his hair began to glow faintly as he nocked an arrow, letting his enhanced vision reveal the true paths beneath the desert's surface. The ancient ways weren't asking for the railroad's destruction, but for its integration into something far more profound. Working through the night, Luke used the bow to mark points where the tracks needed subtle adjustments. Each arrow he fired landed with supernatural precision, leaving behind glowing markers that the crews, now understanding the gravity of their task, used to realign the rails. Nathan, despite his initial skepticism, directed his men with newfound respect for the land they were working. The storm intensified as they approached the final connection point near Pueblo. The air crackled with potential energy, and Luke could see translucent figures watching from the shadows. Not the warrior spirits from before, but ancient guardians waiting to see if humanity would finally learn to build with wisdom rather than just ambition. Eleanor's calculations and Caroline's translations came together in a moment of clarity. The railroad wasn't just connecting towns. It was creating a modern version of ancient trading routes that had once helped maintain harmony between different peoples and the land itself. Luke's bow had been guiding them toward this understanding all along. As dawn approached, Luke stood at the precise spot where the final rails would meet. The bow guided his hands as he fired 3 arrows in rapid succession, each one striking at a critical point that would anchor the new track to the old ways. The storm above began to spiral, drawing in the accumulated energy of all the disturbances they'd corrected along the line. In that moment of convergence, Luke felt the full weight of what the Apache scout had entrusted him with. The bow wasn't just a weapon or a tool. It was a key to understanding how progress could coexist with tradition. The white in his hair blazed like starlight as he fired one final arrow straight into the heart of the storm, completing a circuit that had been waiting centuries to be closed. The dawn that followed revealed a landscape subtly changed. The railroad tracks now hummed with a barely perceptible resonance, aligned with forces that would help maintain balance rather than disrupt it. Luke knew his role had evolved. He wasn't just a sheriff anymore, but a guardian of something far more important than law and order. The bow's weight against his back felt like a promise now, a bridge between past and future that would require constant vigilance to maintain. The final confrontation unfolded beneath a merciless desert sun, as Sheriff Luke Allen stood with the mystical Apache bow drawn tight, its otherworldly energy humming through the ancient wood. Before him, Railroad Baron Nathan Carter's men had transformed the Durango station into a fortress, their rifles glinting from behind stacked crates and water barrels. The sacred bow, gifted by the Apache scout Joshua Lopez after that fateful rescue from the flames, seemed to whisper ancient secrets as Luke held his position. Caroline Nelson, the town's telegraph operator who had discovered Carter's scheme to illegally seize native lands through forged documents, crouched behind an overturned wagon beside Luke. Her quick wit and access to confidential messages had been instrumental in exposing the corruption, though it had cost her father his position as station master. Now she watched with quiet determination as Luke prepared to end this conflict that had torn their community apart. The dry wind carried the scent of creosote and sage as Isaac Hall, the former cavalry scout turned railroad surveyor, worked his way around the station's blind side. His loyalty had shifted when he discovered Carter's men poisoning water sources to drive the Apache from their ancestral lands. The railroad's expansion had become a serpent in the desert, leaving broken promises and displaced families in its wake. Eleanor Carter, Nathan's estranged wife who had sought refuge in Durango after discovering her husband's brutality, emerged from the station's shadowed doorway. Her presence caused the armed men to hesitate, their rifles lowering slightly as she walked with deliberate steps toward Luke. "There's still time to prevent more bloodshed," she called out, her voice carrying across the sun-baked earth. "The federal marshal is riding from Tucson with the evidence we gathered." The sacred bow seemed to respond to Luke's rising determination, its arrow tracking Carter as the Baron emerged from behind his men. "You're a fool, Alan," Carter sneered, his expensive suit coated with desert dust. "This territory belongs to progress, not your misguided sense of justice or some primitive superstitions." His hand inched toward the ivory-handled revolver at his hip, but Luke's arrow was already drawn. Joshua Lopez materialized from the heat-shimmering distance, leading a group of Apache warriors who had come to witness justice being served. The bow had been his people's sacred weapon for generations, given only to those whom the spirits deemed worthy. He had seen that worthiness in Luke during the fire, when the sheriff had risked everything to save him despite the town's prejudices. The tension broke like a thunderclap when Carter drew his pistol. The sacred bow released its arrow with supernatural precision, striking the Baron's weapon and shattering it into glittering shards. The moment seemed frozen in time as Carter's men watched their leader's symbol of power crumble to dust, the ancient magic displaying its supremacy over modern firearms. Charlotte Hall, Isaac's sister, who had been documenting the railroad's violations through her photography, captured the exact moment Carter's empire began to crumble. His men, seeing their leader disarmed by forces they couldn't comprehend, began laying down their weapons. The desert wind carried away their last vestiges of resistance, like scattered seeds. The federal marshal arrived with Caleb Nelson, Caroline's father, who had been gathering evidence in Pueblo. The documentation they carried proved beyond doubt the extent of Carter's crimes against both settlers and native peoples. As Carter was led away in irons, the sacred bow grew warm in Luke's hands, its purpose fulfilled. Rose Lopez, Joshua's daughter who had bridged the worlds between native wisdom and settler justice through her work as a translator, helped draft the new agreements that would protect both the railroad's legitimate expansion and the Apache lands. The bow's intervention had opened a path to cooperation that few had thought possible. In the months that followed, Durango transformed from a battleground to a symbol of collaboration. Luke and Caroline married beneath the desert stars, with Joshua officiating a ceremony that blended both their traditions. The sacred bow hung above the sheriff's office, a reminder that true justice transcends cultural boundaries and that some conflicts require wisdom rather than force to resolve. The railroad still came through Durango, but now it followed a route that honored ancient paths and sacred sites. Eleanor Carter used her former husband's fortune to establish schools that taught both native and settler children, while Isaac and Charlotte Hall's surveys ensured that future expansion would respect the delicate balance between progress and preservation. The desert had witnessed a new kind of victory, one achieved through understanding rather than violence. As Luke stood at his office window years later, watching Apache and settler children playing together in the dusty street, he reflected on how a single act of courage during a fire had changed the territory's destiny. The sacred bow had chosen him not for his skill with weapons, but for his ability to see beyond the surface of things to the truth that connected all people. In the end, that had been the greatest target of all. As the years passed, Luke's legacy grew beyond the boundaries of Durango. The sacred bow, now mounted above his office door, served as a reminder that true leadership meant building bridges rather than walls. Young deputies from across the territory would visit to learn from the sheriff who had changed the course of history not through gunfights, but through understanding and respect. Eleanor Carter's schools flourished, becoming beacons of cultural exchange where Apache elders taught traditional wisdom alongside modern subjects. The children who graduated from these institutions carried forward a new vision of the West, one where different peoples could thrive together without sacrificing their identities. Luke often visited the classrooms, sharing stories of how the territory had transformed from a place of conflict to one of cooperation. In the quiet evenings, Luke would sometimes take the bow down and run his fingers along its smooth surface, remembering the old Apache scout who had given him more than just a weapon. The bow's power had never truly been in its ability to hit targets, but in its role as a symbol of trust between two worlds. Each intricate carving told a story of wisdom passed down through generations, now preserved for future ones. Charlotte Hall's mapping work had expanded beyond simple surveying. She and Isaac had created detailed records of sacred sites, water sources, and traditional hunting grounds, ensuring that development would never again threaten the delicate balance of the desert. Their efforts had inspired similar projects throughout the territory, as other communities sought to blend progress with preservation. The railroad that now crossed the desert became known as the Peace Line, its route a testament to what could be achieved through collaboration. Trading posts and new settlements sprang up along its length, but unlike the boom towns of the past, these communities were planned with care and respect for both the land and its original inhabitants. Luke had helped establish guidelines ensuring that every new development considered its impact on all peoples. Rose, who had witnessed the transformation from its beginning, became a respected voice in territorial affairs. Her experience bridging cultures made her invaluable in resolving disputes between settlers and native peoples. She often reminded others that the desert itself had taught them the most important lesson. Survival depends on cooperation, not competition. The annual gathering at Durango grew from a simple town meeting into a territorial celebration of unity. Apache dancers performed alongside settler musicians, while merchants from both cultures traded goods and stories. Luke would watch from the sidelines, remembering the tense meetings that had once filled these same streets, marveling at how far they had come. In his later years, Luke began training his successor, a young man of mixed Apache and settler heritage who embodied the very change they had worked so hard to achieve. The young deputy understood that wearing the badge meant being a guardian of peace and understanding, not just law and order. Luke saw in him the future they had all dreamed of during those pivotal days. As Luke prepared to retire, he received word that similar changes were spreading across other territories. Representatives from Tucson to Pueblo sought guidance on replicating Durango's success. The sacred bow had indeed found its ultimate target, the heart of understanding that beat within all people, regardless of their origins. On his last day as sheriff, Luke stood once more at his office window. The desert stretched out before him, unchanged yet transformed. The wind still carried the same ancient whispers, but now they spoke of hope rather than conflict. He carefully wrapped the sacred bow in a blanket woven with both Apache and settler patterns, ready to pass it on to the next generation who would continue building bridges across the divide. The story of the sheriff and the sacred bow became legend, told around campfires and in schoolrooms, a reminder that the greatest victories often come not from the power to destroy, but from the courage to understand. In the end, Luke had learned that sometimes the truest aim is not with the eye, but with the heart.